Hi guys, Samantha from GCMA Tutorials here, and today I'm going to show you how to create a basic crackle using a heat gun. Now, this technique can be used to create many more projects by just incorporating it with some other techniques, so it is a great foundation technique to learn. And so I'll show you some examples at the end of the tutorial of some other crackles that I have done using this technique, but adding a few things to create it into a different technique. So I have a sheet of Primo white over here, and it was run out on the thickest setting. And now I just want to show you something before we start that will help you create the crackle. So if I tip it to you like this, hopefully you can see that it is quite shiny. And now this is what raw clay typically looks like. It has this nice shiny sheen to it. Now when you're crackling it, you're looking for that sheen to disappear. So I can't show that very well on my camera because I can't tilt it in the right direction. But when you are using the heat gun at home, you need to look for it to lose that sheen and to turn more matte. And that is what's going to tell you that your clay is cured. Now I'm using a rather large heat gun over here. You can use an embossing heat gun. And basically I'm just going to turn it on. It's going to make a little bit of noise and hopefully you'll be able to see it turn matte. Okay, so half of it I have used the heat gun on. So now I just want to show you a few things that I'll be able to show you in the camera. So when you bake the clay, you'll be able to run your finger across it really quickly because it has baked, so there will be no residue on it. The non-baked version, you will have drag, and this also helps you figure out whether your clay is baked or not. So here's the part that is baked, and here's the part that isn't baked. So hopefully you can see that my finger is dragging there. Well, this one is just smoothing across. Now another thing is the sheen, as I said before. I'll just pick that up carefully, and so hopefully I'll be able to direct that so you can see that this end over here is shiny, and this end, no matter how much I direct it, is not shiny. And that is what your clay is going to look like. So when you want to lay your clay onto a tile, and as you're heat gunning, you want to tilt your head in such a way that you can look at your clay like this, so you can see the sheen coming off of the clay. And then you'll see that the sheen slowly disappears as you're heat gunning. Now another thing when you're doing the heat gun is you want to be waving your gun back and forth so that you aren't holding it in one area, because otherwise you will burn your clay that way. So always remember to just gently wave it back and forth. You don't be waving it like that, you will be waving it back and forth like this. And don't hold it too close. You want to be hovering about that high from your clay. You don't want a long way away because you won't get it the clay hot enough, but you don't want it so close that you might accidentally skim the clay with your gun and accidentally mark it, and you don't want that close because it means that it's going to burn more easily. So I find that that's about the optimum height. Now I'm going to switch it on again. And there we are, the entire piece is baked. Now an important thing to remember is when your clay is hot, it will still feel, as far as when you're pressing it down on it goes, it will still feel raw. So make sure that you allow it enough time to cool before you lift it off of the tile and before you try to crackle it, because you're going to encounter problems otherwise. And now there is a possibility that you might underbake your clay, so just make sure that you let it cool long enough, then give it a gentle push off your finger. And this basically just takes practice, and you might want to practice on some old clay, but you'll get the feel for what is the perfect tension for your clay. So this one's perfectly baked. Now you don't want to be hovering over your clay too long either, because otherwise you'll overbake it and then it won't crackle properly. So this one is my favorite type of crackle. So I gently flex it over here, hopefully it will crack for you. There we are. So you can see it has a nice crack there. Now you can either roll it by hand or you can do it through a pasta machine. I'm going to do it through a pasta machine on the thickest setting. And there you can see it, this is baked. Now I hovered over it a little too long, so I've got a nice coarse crackle. If you hovered over it for too short a time, you'd get a very fine crackle. So depending on what you want, you can vary your time. So the more you hold your heat gun over it, the more coarse and large your crackle's going to be. The shorter time you hover over it, the finer your crackle is going to be. So this is a nice coarse crackle. So I'll take it down one more setting and I'm going to roll it through the opposite way. And you can see that it gives this nice coarse crackle. And this is typically my favourite type. It's a little bit past the medium type of crackle, so it's a little coarser than the middle type, and it's definitely not a fine crackle. But just based on how long you spend waving your heat gun over the clay is going to dictate how coarse your crackle is. So it really does take practice, so I recommend you using leftover clay in the beginning, because I took a lot of practice to get this right to the point where I knew what I was doing. So use your leftover clay, and if it doesn't work, then you can just throw the leftover clay away. It's not going to be using up your nice clay, whereas you probably are going to have to throw away a few pieces. So just use your leftover clay in the beginning. Now I'm going to bring over a few examples of a crackle with a heat gun. Okay, so I'll just bring over those examples. Now there are many different types of crackle. So here's one, and it's a new one that I'm trying to come up with, where basically you get these crackled lines in your piece, and this was done using a heat gun. But the trick is that you don't want any gaps to show. So when you run your finger over this, it's supposed to feel smooth. Whereas the one that I showed you over here, you can see that there are definite gaps between here. So if you run your finger over it, you'll be able to lift up these pieces while it's not baked. So this one, it's a little bit different because you can have a nice smooth crackle over the surface. So that's one type of crackle. And let me just bring over this other one. This is one of my old pieces, so excuse the bad finishing. This one actually includes two types of crackle. This one over here is very similar to the one that I showed you today. As you can see, it's got some really coarse crackled areas, and it's also got some finer areas. So if you wanted to vary your crackle a bit, you could hold your heat gun for more time in some areas of your sheet and hold it for a less amount of time in other parts of the sheet, and then you get a varied crackle, which is quite nice. So this is an example of a varied crackled sheet because this comes from the same sheet. Now I'll explain more about this type of crackle in a little while, but that's a coarse type of crackle. And now you don't have to just crackle plain clay. As I showed in these ones, you can crackle veneers if you wanted to. It creates an interesting effect. So here's one where I crackled a veneer, and that is what I would call a fine crackle. And this one has a little bit more of a coarse crackle. And here is just an example of a plain medium crackle with some clay, and you can see that it's not fine, but it's not coarse either. So this is what I call the optimum crackle. It's my favourite type. But if you held your heat gun a little bit longer, you get a coarse one. If you held it for less amount of time, you get a finer one. So just experiment with the amount of time you let your heat gun sit for above your clay. Now here's another one, and I've actually taught a tutorial on this already, so I'll provide a link to that one. And this one is another medium crackle, but you can see that it's completely different. We've managed to get multiple types of colors in here, and this is what I teach in the tutorial. This is a medium crackle, but there's a lot of other things going on that I teach in the tutorial. And then I'll bring over another version of that technique, just using different supplies. Oops. And here is the same technique that as I showed before, but you can see that depending on what you do with it, you can get different variations. So you can see that we have almost a pattern in here. So this, as you can see, this technique is very versatile. Now here's another one that I have, and to just untangle that a little bit. This one is a very similar technique to this one, but I include a little bit more supplies in it, and so you get this really organic look. And you can see that these two are very different from each other, but they basically use the same crackle technique as I showed you, except that I have included a few more steps in it. So mess around with it and you can come up with some really cool things. Now another example of a crackle technique that actually was not done with a heat gun, just to give you some ideas of what you can do without the heat gun, is this one. So this crackle effect you might be thinking was done with a heat gun. It was not. This is a completely different crackle technique that I stumbled upon completely by accident, and I do plan to teach it pretty soon, but it's a completely different technique from the one that I've shown you today, but it is a crackle technique. So explore around with things like paints, alcohol, inks, pastels, and all sorts of things. Play around with them, see what you can do. You can come up with some really cool crackle effects. But the heat gun one which I showed you today is basically the most common one. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you guys another sheet of white polymer clay that I've crackled, and this is more a fine crackle, so it's a little bit different from the last one where it was quite a coarse crackle. So this is what you get if you were to let your heat gun only hover over it for a little while. So that's the fine crackle. Now I also want to show you guys just a fun technique to do with the crackle. So here's the one that we made before, but I have put some alcohol inks on it and messed around with it a little bit just using some alcohol inks, and you can see it's come out with a really nice pattern. So I'm going to do the same for this one, but it's going to be a different colour. So I'm going to be using pinata inks, and these are the ones that I'm using. And I'm going to actually start with the passion purple. I'm just going to give it a bit of a shake. Now you're also going to need a makeup sponge, because what we want to do is we want to just dab a little bit of that on, and then kind of dab it around the sheet of polymer clay. What this is going to give us is a little bit of difference in colour shades. So some areas are going to have light purple, some areas are going to have dark purple. It's a really nice purple as well. Now the reason I want to use pinata today is because the pinata inks are they have a bit more of a higher colour saturation than to the Adirondack ones. The Adirondack ones, they are more earthy, while these ones are a lot brighter, which is quite nice, which is what I like about them. So I just think that being that we're using white clay and I want to have a nice bright colour to them, I'm going to be using the pinatas. And I'm just dabbing a little bit in here because I want to keep those cracks white. So if you were to dab it, if you were to just drip it on, your cracks would actually come out. You wouldn't be able to get this white showing up through the cracks. So I'm just busy dabbing around a little bit more. So you can see that we have quite a bit of contrast now because of the white showing through in the cracks. Now of course you could just drip the alcohol on, but you wouldn't get these nice white cracks. Now I'm just going to bring over some purple again, and I'm just going to dab a little bit on. Just pop that on. And I'm only using 2 colours, as you can see, but it creates a nice effect. So I'm quite happy with how that looks. Now I'm going to bring over 99% alcohol. So here's what it is. And I'm just going to give that a quick shake, and I'm going to spray from quite a way away. And now watch what it does. So I'll just brighten this up a bit and see if you can see what it's doing. Just let me zoom in just a little bit so that you can see exactly what it's doing. There we go. So I've sprayed it once, now I'm going to spray it again from a long way away. There, hopefully you can see there in more detail what it is doing. I might spray it a little bit over there because it creates these nice patches. So some areas you might get a little bit more cloudy, while some areas will be a bit sharper. So just mess around with it. The trick is to spray it far enough away that you're just getting tiny little droplets. So I'm quite happy with that now. So that's the finer crackle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lift this up gently. And I'm going to gently stretch the crackle in both directions to expand those white areas to give it a little bit more contrast. And now the other one that I showed you before was done using the same blue that I have used here, and it was done using a green. Let me just go get the green to see what it was. And actually it wasn't a green, it was this yellow. So the yellow and the blue mixed together to create that really lovely green colour. So I'll just move this over a bit so you can see what this one is. And so this one I decided to drip it on instead of using the makeup sponge, and so you can see that it's kind of got into the lines over here. Well, this one I dabbed on, so I kept the white lines, so the two look quite different. So I'll just zoom in again for you guys to see what it looks like. So that's basically it for today's tutorial, and so I do hope that it was helpful to you. And if it was, please do let me know, as that is always helpful to me. And please send in photos of what you do using your crackle technique. I'd love to see. You can send it in on my Facebook page, you can send it in through the website. Just let me see the photos, please, as I always love seeing the photos. And I'll comment on it and let you know what I think. And please feel free to ask questions. If you do have any questions, I'm always available to answer those. And as always, I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Bye for now.